Introduction. In 1945, a remarkable film was produced, the result of an unusual combination of interests. The United States Navy, black rights advocates, social scientists, and the Hollywood movie community all contributed to a curious work of propaganda entitled The Negro Sailor. This is the first of 3 videos assessing the film's content, its origin, and its cultural significance and impact. This video describes the film's content, covering these topics. 1. An idealized setting. 2. The egalitarian navy. 3. Black military heroes. 4. Equal opportunities. 5. Historic black military participation. For the benefit of anyone listening to this video without watching it, when citing the film itself, I will first describe the scene to which I am referring and then play the relevant footage. An idealized setting. Characteristic of the era, this film has a long opening sequence, with the title appearing 20 seconds in. At 39 seconds, just after production credits, this text appears. Quote, "In this film, all scenes depicting Navy personnel and activities are either scenes of actual naval units photographed by Navy camera crews, or authentic incidents recreated to conform exactly with conditions existing in the naval establishment at the time of filming." End quote. This is clearly intended to assure viewers that this film is an entirely accurate representation of the experiences any black man should expect to encounter upon their enlistment in the Navy. The message being sent is that although this film includes dramatization, it is definitely not military propaganda, but fact. Of course, this film definitely is military propaganda. At 1 minute and 41 seconds, we meet Frank Roberts, sports editor at a newspaper company. Frank is black, but is presented in every way as though thoroughly assimilated to the dominantly white culture of the United States. Dressed in a highly respectable suit of the current fashion, his hair is groomed neatly, closely cropped, and brushed flat over his head in a very tidy manner. Frank speaks in a high register with a cultured accent indistinguishable from the speech of the middle-class white men we see later. His accent is markedly different to the low-register speech of the black male boy who interrupts his work. Frank answers a phone call from a man he identifies as, quote, the boss, end quote, and whom he addresses as, quote, Mr. Weldon, end quote, and, quote, sir, end quote.
Frank Roberts, Sports. Oh, is he in now? Thanks.
So Johnson got
The boss. Oh, hello, Mr. Weldon. This is Frank Roberts. I'd like to see you. I think I have a great idea for a new column. Yes, sir, I'll be in right away.
Frank's relationship with this man is immediately established as subordinate, and we can already guess that the boss will be white. However, we also hear that Frank wishes to meet his boss to pitch him a new idea, introducing us to the concept that Frank exercises personal agency within his workplace, and that his opinions are taken seriously by his superior. However unlikely this may seem to us, these ideas are foundational to the later narrative, and the film therefore takes care to establish them as early as possible. Frank enters Mr. Weldon's office and is immediately offered a seat. The atmosphere is light and casual, and Mr. Weldon addresses him courteously as an equal. Contrary to what we probably expected, Mr. Weldon is black. In fact, we have probably started to notice that all of the staff we have seen so far are black, suggesting strongly that this company has been affected by segregation. Mr. Weldon is dressed and groomed as neatly as Frank, and he speaks in the same high register, though curiously his accent is more working class, sounding to me almost like a typical New Jersey accent, though I'm sure someone with superior linguistic knowledge will correct me on that point. These are black men who present as white men, subtly suggesting that socio-economic opportunities are equally available to both black and white citizens of the United States, a key concept on which this film rests. Frank explains that his new idea is a newspaper column focused on the concept of, quote, teamwork and the complete democracy of it, and the fact that a man is measured only by his ability and skill, end quote. To which Mr. Weldon replies, quote, "Yes, that's right," end quote.
Teamwork. Teamwork and the complete democracy of it. And the fact that a man is measured only by his ability and skill.
Yes, that's right.
At a mere 2 minutes past the opening credits, the film's fundamental premise has been revealed transparently. A black man joining the Navy will be treated as an equal with his white peers, judged only on his merits, and rewarded in proportion to his achievements. Given the extremely unequal social conditions actually faced by black people in the United States in 1945, when this film was made, it would be fair to call this premise military propaganda, and the film itself a form of social conditioning. In a highly loaded comment, Frank says, quote, "Now, you've seen some great white teams and some great colored teams, and some with both whites and Negroes as teammates," end quote.
Now, you've seen some great white teams and some great colored teams, and some with both whites and Negroes as teammates.
Yes, I have.
The obvious existence of segregated teams is deliberately softened by the reference to teams with both black and white members, though it was only in 1947, 2 years after this film was made, that black baseball player Jackie Robinson was called up by the Brooklyn Dodgers to play in a mixed major league team. That was the first time since 1884 that an openly black player had officially played for a major league team. Meanwhile, by 1946, only one NFL team had any black players, the Rams, with Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. The overwhelming majority of NFL teams had no black players until the 1950s, and national basketball teams likewise only started becoming integrated at that time. Consequently, we are left to wonder exactly which great teams Mr. Weldon could possibly have seen by 1945, which had, quote, both whites and Negroes as teammates, end quote. Frank talks Mr. Weldon into coming out with him to see an event which will illustrate his plan. Although Mr. Weldon initially claims he is too busy, Frank insists, and Mr. Weldon capitulates by saying, quote, "If you think it's important, I suppose I could," end quote. This again serves to highlight Frank's agency and the respect he has from his employer, though this is far less surprising now we know they are both black. Nevertheless, it serves the film's underlying premise that supervisors and subordinates can have a healthy and harmonious relationship of mutual respect, even while the subordinate is under the authority and power of their workplace superior. This is an important message to send a black man if you want him to join the Navy. With a courteous knock, another black employee enters the office. This is Bill, who announces that he has just received his induction papers. We know from the film's opening scene that Bill has joined the Navy, and we can already guess that we will be following Bill's career progress throughout the narrative. Bill requests a couple of days off to organize his family affairs, and Mr. Weldon generously advises him to, quote, take as many days as you want, end quote. Again, it is suggested that employees can expect respect and consideration from their employers, tacitly validating the hierarchical nature of their relationship. At the end of this scene, Frank asks Bill to accompany him that afternoon to an event he does not disclose. Finally, the scene shifts to that afternoon event. Frank, Bill, and Mr. Weldon are at a football game, admiring the teamwork of the winning side. The audience consists of an unsegregated mixture of black and white men, and though both teams are predominantly white, they both have black players. This certainly cannot be the NFL, since this film is set in 1945, and by 1946, only the Rams had any black players. However, the US Navy is seen to be attending in great numbers, so this is very likely to be a game between members of the Navy. The winning touchdown is scored thanks to teamwork between a white player and his black teammate, the subtext of which is obvious. After the touchdown, Frank comments, quote, "That's teamwork in action. Different kinds of men fighting together for one goal. But I'm thinking of a much greater team, one that's playing in the most important game of all. That team is the United States Navy," end quote. This is followed up by an important exchange between Bill and Frank, during which Frank utters a line which encapsulates the film's core message.
That's the team I hope to get on. And if you make it, Bill, you'll be right in there along with Bob, and Ole, Tony, Pedro, and Lee, and Joe. All of them fighting together. Now that's the kind of teamwork that I'd like to make the backbone of my new column.
That is an idea. Let's call it On the Navy Team.
Frank's comment about Bill fighting alongside Bob and Ollie, Tony, Pedro and Lee and Joe very obviously incorporates the names of a range of men from different ethnic groups, apparently Anglo-Saxon and possibly German, as well as Italian, Spanish, Chinese and African American. It's worth reflecting on whether a white audience in 1945 would consider this to be forced diversity. Of course, the subtext is that all of these men have an equal opportunity to serve their country in the Navy, and that when they do so, they work together as members of a harmonious team. The audience is being assured that whatever the experience of the African American in mainstream society, the Navy will assure them an egalitarian working opportunity in a supportive, multicultural environment. There are just two more points to consider before we leave this scene. One is that Frank's column, writing about Bill's experiences in the Navy, is being used to make this entire film more approachable to an African American audience. The idea for this plan originates with a black man, Frank, and it will be a black man, Bill, who communicates to the audience his experiences in the Navy. The aim here is to convince the audience that although this is, at least in part, a dramatization, it is an authentic record of the kind of experience a black sailor will have. The second point is that Mr. Weldon calls this newspaper column, quote, "On the Navy team," end quote, which again reinforces the film's core message. This upbeat title is a distinct contrast to the film's own name, quote, "The Negro Sailor," end quote. But of course, while the film's content is aimed at a black audience, the film's title was written for a white audience. The egalitarian Navy. Throughout the next section, the film goes out of its way to assure viewers that naval life takes place within an egalitarian environment in which black men are treated with as much respect and courtesy as anyone else, especially the white men. Care is also taken to demonstrate that white men will be treated with the same level of discipline as black men. During an inspection of the sailors' folded uniforms and other clothing and gear, the officer in charge calls out a few minor issues in passing, such as, quote, "loose rolls," end quote, but it's unclear whether he's referring to black men or white men. However, the camera then focuses on a white sailor whose clothing is inspected in detail. One officer reprimands him seriously for having failed to use correct knots, and another officer deliberately picks up the sailor's neatly ordered clothing and dumps it messily all over the floor as a punishment. Straight after this, the camera turns to a black sailor who is asked by the officer, quote, "What's an ensign?" end quote. The black sailor first answers uncertainly, quote, "Well, you are. The flag. Both of you are," end quote. But in response to a stern look from the officer, he adds more confidently, quote, "It means a commissioned officer. It also means the flag, sir," end quote. In response, the officer simply nods and continues walking without any reprimand or punitive action. The strong contrast between these two exchanges, in which the white sailor was punished for a very minor infraction, while the black sailor's hesitant answer is treated with tolerance and left uncommented on, is obviously intended to convince viewers that the Navy's officers will be strict but fair and egalitarian in their assessments and discipline. The scenes are rather heavy-handed and completely unsubtle, but this simply shows how determined the Navy is to send its message. Later, the same message is sent again, even more directly, when the narrator informs us that Navy rules, quote, "apply to everybody," end quote. We are then shown Bill laboriously scrubbing a path on his hands and knees, which we infer is punishment for some breach of discipline. However, the narrator is quick to assure us that, quote, "he had company," end quote, showing us other men who are also being disciplined with cleaning duties. These men are identified as Bob, Pedro, Ollie, and Lee, characters we have seen previously, and who are obviously representing a range of different ethnic groups to show that Navy discipline is applied equally and fairly to all sailors without prejudice. However, this portrayal of an egalitarian environment is occasionally interrupted in subtle ways. At 9 minutes 44 seconds, a scene depicts uniformed sailors dancing with civilian women. The camera pans and zooms while the couples waltz sedately. There is no black jazz here. And careful viewers will notice that while all the men are black, none of the women are white. They are predominantly black, with the possible exception of one or two who may be Asian, possibly Chinese or Korean, given the fact that during this time many Japanese American civilians had been incarcerated in concentration camps. This scene demonstrates that even if the Navy's internal atmosphere is as egalitarian as it claims, the Navy still submits to social norms like racial segregation when interacting in the public sphere. Black military heroes. From 10 minutes 54 seconds, we see Bill viewing a gallery of artwork commemorating the achievements of black sailors who were recognized and awarded for outstanding service. This scene describes the heroism of Doris Miller, Albert H. Oliver, William Pinckney, and Leonard Roy Harmon, praising them enthusiastically and identifying the medals they received, before adding, quote, "and there are hundreds of others," end quote. However, it must be noted that all of these men are clearly identified as steward's mates or cooks. None of them are officers, and none of them even hold positions with specific combat duties, such as pilot or gunner. In fact, all of them are remarkable precisely because they performed extraordinary feats of valor, even participating in combat, despite being untrained for it. Having seen this gallery of heroes, Bill comments, quote, "And I thought steward's mates were just waiters," end quote. Another black sailor enters the scene, commenting, quote, "Well, Johnson, you might call them that, but they're fighting men too. Between battles, their work is rather dull, but somebody has to be a waiter, or a cook, or a storekeeper. Everybody can't be captain on this ship," end quote.
And I thought steward's mates were just waiters. Well, Johnson, you might call them that, but they're fighting men too. Between battles, their work is rather dull, but somebody has to be a waiter, or a cook, or a storekeeper. Everybody can't be captain on this ship.
Clearly, the Navy wishes black viewers to internalize messages such as, just because you're going to be assigned to a low-ranking non-combat role doesn't mean you can't be a hero. It is equally clear the Navy does not want black viewers thinking, why are black men consistently given low-ranking catering roles? Or, sure, somebody has to be a waiter or cook, but why are black sailors typically assigned to these positions rather than higher ones? Or, why aren't there any black officers in this gallery? Or, granted, not everybody can be a captain, but why are captains only ever white men? Instead, this section of the film is being used to prepare black recruits to accept the fact that even in the supposedly egalitarian Navy, they will still be given subordinate positions. This is made almost painfully obvious when the black sailor speaking with Bill assures him, quote, "And believe me, when it comes to fighting, the steward's mates are right in there with the rest of them," end quote. To which Bill replies, quote, "That's real teamwork, sir," end quote.
Believe me, when it comes to fighting, the steward's mates are right in there with the rest of them.
That's real teamwork, sir.
You bet it is.
But it's not real teamwork when some men are deliberately given lower-ranking roles due to their ethnicity, while still being expected to fight when duty calls. At this time, steward's mates belonged to the steward's branch, who were assigned to catering duties. Sooner or later, Bill will discover that Navy regulations actually prohibited white sailors from being recruited for the steward's branch, and that roles in this service were fulfilled overwhelmingly by African Americans. In his 1985 book, Integration of the Armed Forces 1940 to 1965, Army historian Morris J. McGregor explains that the steward's branch, quote, "composed entirely of enlisted Negroes and Oriental aliens," by which he means Asian non-citizens, "mostly Filipinos," end quote. However, McGregor also adds that, quote, "despite the fact that their enlistment contracts restricted their training and duties, stewards, like everyone else aboard ship, were assigned battle stations, including positions at the guns and on the bridge," end quote. This is mentioned specifically in the film itself. The black sailor speaking with Bill assures him that, quote, "and because their primary job is fighting, steward's mates' instruction includes standard courses in airplane and ship recognition, ship compartmentation, and gunnery," end quote.
And because their primary job is fighting, steward's mates' instruction includes standard courses in airplane and ship recognition, ship compartmentation, and gunnery.
But of course, this is only partly true. It certainly wasn't true that, quote, their primary job is fighting, end quote. Although they were expected to occupy battle stations in combat, their primary job was not fighting, it was catering management. Additionally, the combat training they did receive was typically limited to reconnaissance and gun maintenance. One of the reasons why Doris Miller, the famous black cook who fought so gallantly at Pearl Harbor, was so highly praised for his actions was that he had defended his ship with an anti-aircraft machine gun so competently, shooting down at least 2 Japanese planes, despite having received no training on how to fire the weapon. In fact, he had only been assigned to the gun as an ammunition loader, while it was operated by a white sailor. These historical facts expose the truth behind the film's enthusiastically egalitarian narrative. Equal opportunities. The next section of the film presents a wide range of career opportunities to black sailors, which are also presented as typical roles assigned to other ethnic groups, both white and non-white. The narrator tells us that, quote, so while Bill is on his way to becoming a quartermaster, other Bills, Tonys, Bobs, Pedros are on their way to becoming radio men, aviation metalsmiths, aviation machinist mates, gunners mates, and other specialists, end quote. Throughout this section, the value of these roles is emphasized, reinforcing the film's theme that whatever position a black sailor may occupy during their service, it is just as important as all the others. Naturally, this is intended to smooth over the fact that roles for black sailors were still significantly restricted to subordinate positions. At 19 minutes and 15 seconds, we learn Bill is assigned on duty to a destroyer, which we are informed is, quote, manned by a predominantly Negro crew, end quote.
The next time I heard from Bill, he wrote me that he had been ordered to duty aboard a destroyer escort, manned by a predominantly Negro crew.
It's unclear if this is intended to be an example of opportunities for black men in the Navy, or if it's an unfortunate reflection of latent segregation, but the former is more likely. Finally, we're told Bill is, quote, ready to go into the game, end quote, and the narrator provides a long list of other men with whom he will be serving, both white and non-white, who hold a wide variety of other positions. We are told that, quote, these and more are on the same team as Bill, end quote. Black men are shown in roles such as signaling, reconnaissance, radar, radio, sonar, ship gun maintenance, and even firing the ship's guns. The narrator's comment is, quote, yes, every sailor plays a vital position to make this team the greatest navy in the world, end quote. Again, sending a message of equal opportunity. However, from what we have seen previously, we know that this is only a carefully qualified egalitarianism. Historic black military participation. The final section of this film pays tribute to the participation of African Americans in the US Navy during the Second World War, saying, quote, they were there at the end of the first half when these German U-boats surrendered in the Atlantic, and they were there at the finish in the Pacific, end quote. The film also acknowledges the sacrifices of African American sailors, though in a rather obviously politicized manner. At 26 minutes 7 seconds, we see a white man pushing a black sailor in a wheelchair before the scene dissolves into a shot of a graveyard covered with markers, where we are told black sailors also lie. The final narration of the film is this stirring tribute to the historical military contributions of, quote, Americans of all races and origins, end quote.
Throughout our history, Americans of all races and origins have fought side by side in defense of their country. Since the first battle of the Revolution, when our country was born, through more than 160 years, through all our wars, colored Americans like the Bill Johnsons of today have fought and died to bring victory to our arms.
Although these sound like noble words, this is blatant historical revisionism in the service of propaganda. The extent to which, quote, Americans of all races and origins, end quote, have ever been able to fight, quote, side by side in defense of their country, end quote, has always been strongly restricted by the prejudice and racism of the US government and its white civilians. In fact, for most of US history, this has not even been possible, except in very limited circumstances. The statement that, quote, colored Americans, end quote, have served, quote, since the first revolution, end quote, all through, quote, more than 160 years, through all our wars, end quote, is substantially true, But the juxtaposition of this statement in close proximity with the previous phrase, quote, Americans of all races and origins have fought side by side in defense of their country, end quote, sends the completely inaccurate message that throughout US history, black men have always been able to fight side by side with Americans of all races and origins. Even a cursory review of the historical record demonstrates how false this message is. African American men did fight in the Revolutionary War against the British, and some even became Marines. For most of US history after that time, however, African Americans were either prevented from serving in the military or only permitted to serve in a very limited capacity, typically in non-combat support roles, and overwhelmingly only in all-black units. From 1798 to 1947, the Marine Corps rule was, quote, no Negro, mulatto, or Indian to be enlisted, end quote. In the Civil War, free black men were permitted to serve in the Union Army after President Lincoln lifted a ban on them in 1862. However, they served in segregated all-black units, certainly not, quote, side by side, end quote, with Americans of all races and origins. Likewise, in World War I, black Americans were only permitted to serve in segregated units. When the US Air Force was inaugurated in 1918, it banned non-whites from enlisting. In World War II, black Americans were allowed to enlist in the Army and Air Force, but again, only in segregated units. The one curious exception to this was the Navy, which had historically been slightly more open to African American black servicemen. During World War I, black Americans were not only permitted to enlist in the Navy, they served in integrated units alongside white and other non-black personnel. However, even then they were overwhelmingly assigned non-combat service roles such as catering and engine maintenance. Nevertheless, after World War I, even the Navy abandoned its marginal tolerance for black recruits, and in 1919 it banned African Americans from enlisting completely, a prohibition which was not lifted until 1932. So the final enthusiastic words of this film are not the wholesome praise they appear to be. They are not an official recognition of the immense sacrifices made by black American military personnel to a nation which had trodden them underfoot for centuries. These words are a gross whitewash of history which undermines significantly the film's apparently noble aim and expose it as military propaganda. Conclusion. Like all propaganda, this film was created to serve the interests of its makers rather than the interests of its audience. The US Navy was in urgent need of recruits and was attempting to make itself more attractive to a demographic it had traditionally neglected and treated with contempt. This film has consistently been identified as propaganda by both film critics and historians of African American representation in media. As an example, filmographer Larry Richards, in his 1998 book African American Films Through 1959, a comprehensive illustrated filmography, states bluntly, quote, "The Negro Sailor was a propaganda film, emphasizing the need for racial harmony for victory," end quote. The film's cynical motive is further exposed by the fact that, despite being produced in summer 1945, it was not released until much later. The end of World War II, just a few months after the film was completed, immediately reduced the Navy's previously urgent need for recruits. Ellen C. Scott's work, Cinema Civil Rights, Regulation, Repression and Race in the Classic Hollywood Era, 2015, notes that, quote, "Absent the wartime imperative, the image of black inclusion was no longer a national priority," end quote, and that consequently, quote, "pro-integration government films like The Negro Sailor, 1945, a follow-up to the wartime Negro Soldier, 1944, were delayed," end quote. Much closer to the era, Florence Murray, writing in the 1947 volume of the periodical The Negro Handbook, noted that the film, quote, "was made in the summer of 1945, but has never been released," end quote. The extent to which the film depicted accurately the experience of the average black recruit in the US Navy at the time is certainly vulnerable to scrutiny. Nevertheless, its portrayal of the African American experience in the armed forces was not completely whitewashed. Some sections are more honest than others. The United States National Archives and Records Administration's catalogue of motion pictures on World War II acknowledges the film, quote, still shows aspects of segregation, end quote. Ironically, as this video has demonstrated, the film presented broader society in a far less realistic light than it did the US Navy. Writing in 1951, after the film had finally been released, English teacher Joseph Langhorne of Cardozo High School in Washington, D.C., where the film was shown, commented that the films The Negro Soldier and The Negro Sailor, quote, represent idealized pictures of conditions that did not exist when these films were made during the war, end quote. Nevertheless, African-American historian and black rights activist Lawrence Dunbar Reddick regarded the film highly, writing in 1947, quote, the film The Negro Sailor, made by the Navy, even now ought to be shown to all Navy men and to the public as well, end quote. Despite being fully aware of its propagandist aim, Reddick still acknowledged its positive representation of African Americans and regarded it as a valuable tool in the battle for broader social integration. The next video in this series will address the question of whether or not the US Navy was as pro-integrationist as it presented itself, and will examine the extent to which the film represents accurately the experience of the black sailor during the era.